Time now is 12 minutes to 9. Have you heard of gallium or germanium? Perhaps not, but they're absolutely vital to the manufacture of new technology. China is starting to restrict exports of those materials, which are key to the semiconductor industry. This is all part of a tit-for-tat policies, as Washington's been making efforts to limit Beijing's access to advanced microprocessor technology. We can talk now to Dr. Gavin Harper, Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham, and also to Scott White, who's founder and executive director of Pragmatic Semiconductor. Good morning to you both.
Morning.
Let me begin with you, first of all, Scott, and just explain to us why these elements are important for the manufacture of microprocessors.
Sure. So probably most people have heard about silicon chips that are the main microprocessors we have in our laptops and mobile phones and so forth. But actually, when you look beneath the kind of high level of what semiconductors are, there's a range of different semiconductor materials. Gallium and germanium that you mentioned are two specialist materials that are used for particular types of semiconductor devices, in particular high performance devices like high frequency wireless or power electronics or photonics technologies. So they may not be the microprocessor, but they're certainly relevant for many of the other things that we rely on semiconductor chips for in our myriad devices.
And China is a big manufacturer of these, or big producer of these metal elements. So what impact is the export restrictions, is it likely to have on your business?
So in Pragmatic's case, we make very unique, flexible semiconductor devices using metal oxides. We do actually use a tiny amount of gallium in those, but it's such a small amount that we're not actually exposed from a supply chain perspective. It will potentially impact others in the UK. The UK has particular strengths in what's called compound semiconductors, which often involve these kinds of materials. But I think what's important to note is there are other sources for these materials, and those other countries that make these materials can ramp up production. The last several decades of sort of globalization have led to very concentrated supply in certain areas. That's obviously been shifting in the last few years as we've sort of perhaps moved back to a bit more localization or control of supply chains. And there are ways to balance that, but it also potentially needs innovation in supply chains and material use. And that's, for example, one of the things Pragmatic's been focused on.
Well, let me bring in Gavin now, because it's one of these things that may seem obscure. People may not have heard of gallium and germanium, but it could actually have a very big impact on their lives.
Yes, Martha, I think, it's one of those things where people, because supply chains are so opaque, people don't necessarily see how these materials translate into components, and those components then end up in products. And one of the things that we saw with the semiconductor shortage over the past couple of years is how sort of small, obscure components that people really don't pay much attention to can have massive impacts on other industries. If we look at how the automotive industry was crippled by the shortage of certain semiconductor devices. And I think it's the opacity of these supply chains which makes it difficult to predict some of the effects that these export limitations may have on certain industries.
And we need to see this, don't we, in a geopolitical context. This is the tit for tat I was describing, what's also called resource nationalism.
Yes, so I think it's been said that China is responding to the control of the export of lithography machines. So they're the machines which take the very detailed plans and schematics of semiconductor devices and sort of translate those into the actual design on the chip. And without that technology and access to that technology, they will be unable to make certain devices. And so they've responded by saying that they're going to potentially limit and export control the supply of materials that are crucial to the production of these devices. Now, critical materials, it's a broad term that applies to a whole range of materials. They're materials which are economically important, but at risk of short supply, and those risks can come in many forms we're seeing at the moment.
So what's being done to manage any potential shortages?
So I think, the UK has had to formulate its own independent critical materials policy outside of the European Union as a result of Brexit. And so the UK has been establishing an infrastructure around critical materials. What's very interesting is that the US and the EU consider both gallium and germanium as critical materials that are on their watch list. The UK, by contrast, has only focused on gallium. Germanium isn't on the UK critical materials list. It will be interesting to see if that's updated, but perhaps it's seen as less critical to UK industry. So certainly now the UK has that infrastructure for managing its response around materials criticality challenges.
Yeah.
Now, there are all sorts of things that can be done. As it's been said, diversification of supplies. So looking to other countries where perhaps there's mothballed plant that could be used to produce these critical materials, looking at recycling, looking at substitution if other materials can be used in place.
Lots of possible options at any rate. Dr. Gavin Harper and Scott White, thank you both.